Good morning and welcome to today's virtual event, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I'm Carla Wright, the CFO and Facilities Director at Greater Louisville, Inc., the Metro Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I hope every one of you all is staying safe out there. Over the past 3 months, we have not only seen how we live, but how we work shift drastically, and none so more than those of us that work in traditional office environments. Companies have pivoted quickly to remote work. Most have adjusted really well. However, we now pivot again to the return of work phase of COVID-19. But the way we work will look and feel different from the last time we sat at our desk. For today's discussion, we're excited to have our GLI top investor, Office Resources Inc., or ORI, as well as representatives from Steelcase with us. Both companies have been working hard to formulate and discuss design plans currently being implemented both locally and nationally to keep our employers and our employees safe at work. Before I turn things over, I'd like to give you an outline for today's discussion. After these brief presentations, we will take questions from you. Please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen, and our team will sort through your questions and try to cover as many topics at the time we have allotted for today. For a summary of today's discussion or access to other COVID-19 resources, please check back and visit greaterlouisville.com. With that, I'd like to welcome the President and CEO of ORI, George Bell. George?
Thank you, Carla. We're excited to be a top investor. We really appreciate the value of your voice that you give us locally and the voice you give us in Frankfurt. Appreciate the reach that you guys have provided in terms of economic development. The city has changed just a whole bunch since I arrived in Louisville in 2004. And finally, we really appreciate the opportunity to connect with other leaders and businesses like we are today to share insights and best practices. I'm thrilled to introduce in just a few minutes Dr. Tracy Brower. She'll speak on competing in a post-COVID environment, and we hope, or competing in a COVID environment, and then we hope at some point in a post-COVID era, and the role that physical space plays within this. And today we hope to answer 3 questions for you. And the questions are, when do you bring employees back to the office, and how do you do it safely? How do you bring your employees back, and what role will work from home play in this expanded ecosystem? And then finally, why bring people back to the office? And we'll spend most of the time on this. We believe there's an opportunity cost associated with not effectively leveraging this important asset, the office. Before I introduce Dr. Tracy Brower, though, let me briefly introduce a few of my associates. I'd like to introduce Kyle Dozma. Kyle is the market president of ORI and leads our efforts in the Kentucky marketplace. We've got Jeff Scott, and Jeff is a regional sales manager with Steelcase, located in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Jeff leads the selling efforts. And we have Casey, who is a regional sales manager also in the Midwest and is leading, along with Jeff, the sales efforts for Steelcase. Let me give you just a quick background and bio on Dr. Brower, and then we'll turn it over to her. So Dr. Tracy Brower is a PhD psychologist and a principal with Steelcase's Applied Research and Consulting Group. Tracy studies the psychology of work and the changing nature of work, workers, and the workplace. She's an author of Bring Work to Life by Bringing Life to Work and a contributor to Forbes and Fast Company. She works at Steelcase. Steelcase, for those that don't know, is the world's largest provider of high-performance environments and an industry leader in terms of research and insights. It's my pleasure to turn the event over to Tracy.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. Thanks for that nice introduction, George, of all of the team members. And we really, really appreciate our partnership with ORI and with you in particular. And thank you so much for having us to the GLI group. We really appreciate it. We are super excited about this topic and looking forward to the time that we will spend on it. There will be some opportunities for you to weigh in with some of your thinking as well. So really looking forward to the conversation. So here is something for us to start with. When the paradigm shifts, everyone goes back to zero. For those of you who are old enough to remember, we used to use the word paradigm in business all the time. I'm pretty sure that's aging me significantly, but it got to be really business jargony and it lost its meaning because we used it so much. But it is so apt today. This is the idea that no matter how great your buggy is, you're not going to sell a whole lot when the automobile comes to call. And so when the paradigm shifts, everyone goes back to zero. And that's where we're at today. The paradigm has shifted so much. And so this seems like a really important place to start as we think about getting back to the office, as we think about the why of the office, and as we think about how we return and how we continue some of our working from home. Our context has changed so much. So let's talk about some of those paradigms that have shifted. I love to think about the Maslow hierarchy. You all learned about this in high school. And one of the things that we've done as business people over the years is we've spent a lot of time at the top of that Maslow hierarchy. We worry about belonging toward the top and whether people have a sense of belonging. We worry about esteem and whether they feel valued. We worry about self-actualization and whether people are really able to self-actualize their work. And those are the right things to be thinking about. The interesting thing that has happened lately is that lots of people have been kind of bumped right back down to the bottom of that Maslow hierarchy. And we have new concerns about physiological wellness, about basic safety and security. And so as we think about employees, as we think about ourselves, we have to think about coming from a really different place. That difference in where we are on that Maslow hierarchy is changing our behavior really significantly. And so some of the paradigms that are shifting have to do with safety and security. The companies that succeed, that win, will be those that deliver on safety and security. For some of those, it's their core competence. There was a great CBS This Morning show about a little guy who'd been making plexiglass out of his garage, and he had a nice little business going on, and now it's going gangbusters. There's lots of organizations that do cleaning and remediation and really paying attention to safety and security as their core competence that are going crazy right now. In addition, there are companies that are winning because they do safety well. We will choose the restaurant that feels cleaner than the restaurant that doesn't. Someday, if we ever get to go to a movie again, we will choose the movie theater where we feel like there is safe distancing going on versus the one where there isn't. And so safety and security is driving our choices, and it's driving businesses as a result as well. Health is critical. Telehealth has moved from 3% of the market to 70% of the market. We're paying attention to our health in new and productive ways. Well-being and mental state are huge right now. Mental health issues are going crazy. They're going through the roof in terms of people's consideration for mental health, concern about mental health, some decay of mental health because the pandemic has been so stressful. And so businesses that offer mental health counseling, apps that offer mental health services, those kinds of opportunities in the marketplace are really winning. They're rising because of the paradigms that are shifting. Relationships are super interesting as well. We are seeing an absolute rise in social services, in counseling services, in marriage counseling, in divorce attorneys, in marriages, because our close relationships are under a magnifying glass right now. As our broader circles have gotten smaller, those close relationships are under the magnifying glass. And that's why we're seeing businesses that support relationships in various ways really coming to the fore. Life cycle is super interesting as well. Any good demographer will tell you businesses that rise and fall follow the life cycle. So if we have a baby boom in 4 or 6 months, or maybe even less, we will be able to see the rise of businesses that sell diapers and cribs, and then a couple of years later that sell toddler toys, and so on. The other thing that's interesting to think about is the experience of home. We are all spending a lot more time at home. That means we're putting more wear and tear on things like our coffee maker because we're using it at home instead of using it at the office. We're going through supplies in a different way. We are looking around and saying, you know, honey, I think that carpeting could be replaced. It's a little more worn than I remembered. Or we're looking outside and saying, you know, maybe we should put that new deck on. So people are investing in their experience of home. And we're moving from a model of retrieve, where we go out and shop, we go out and work out, we go out and work, to a model of receive, where so much more is delivered to our front doors. And that is changing the nature of the marketplace as well. And finally, this is super interesting. We are entertaining ourselves differently. If you think about the American sin taxes on things like alcohol or cigarettes, alcohol sales are at an all-time high, for example. In addition, bicycle sales are at an all-time high. The sales of electric bikes are at an all-time high. Puzzle companies are going crazy. So that little company that made puzzles now cannot keep up with demand. We're doing lots more in terms of binge watching on television. Much of our entertainment is centered in the home and centered in a tighter circle. The reason this is all important to us is because it creates context for us and our contributions. It also creates context for the businesses that we serve and the businesses that we are. So I always like to start with this discussion about paradigms. But I'd like to hear from you as well. We want to make sure this isn't all one way. So if you wouldn't mind going ahead and putting an A, B, C, or D in the chat box, we're going to do a highly scientific survey, but want to ask you, as you think about the future, how significant do you expect the changes in the work experience to be? A, sweeping, things will never be the same. B, moderate, things will be different, but not too overwhelming. C, insignificant, things will be crazy for a while, but then they will pretty much get back to normal. Or D, I'm not so sure, things seem to be changing daily. So go ahead and log your response here, A, B, C, or D. That would be brilliant. I want to give you another minute to think about it and talk just for a second about voting. One of the things that's super interesting is how exhausted many of us are through this pandemic. And we say to ourselves, why am I exhausted? I'm spending more time at home. I'm hanging out with my dog or my partner or my roommate more. Why is this so exhausting? And I think it has to do with equilibrium. A lot of times, if you've ever spent time on a boat, you can go out boating for the day and, you know, you've enjoyed the sun and you've enjoyed your friends and you've had a really good time, maybe eating snacks, and you get back at the end of the day and you are exhausted. Why is that? Because the boat is constantly moving. And even if you're sitting on the boat, you're in this constant state of getting re-equilibrium, of reorienting yourself at a physical level. And I think that's a great analogy for what's going on with us today. We are constantly reacclimating. We just think we have things pretty well figured out. We think we've got some clarity and we think we know what's next, and things change again and change again and change again. And that can be really exhausting. So anyway, I think that analogy is pretty fun and pretty interesting to consider. Jeff, how are we doing on our votes? Are we having some things come in on this one in terms of A's and B's and C's and D's?
Yes, Tracy. So we've got got a nice distribution of A's and lots of B's. So a lot of B's. B's are the highest point on this distribution.
B's are winning the day on this one, huh, Jeff?
They are.
Okay, wonderful. You know, that is really, really interesting. And I have to say, I'm fascinated by this question because I think our perceptions are so much our realities. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, lots and lots of people were saying A, and I think more and more of us are saying B now. I think it's partly because we're adapting, because we're adopting, because we're starting to get used to some of this. The interesting thing is your perspective on this is all based on your role, your region, your business. And so there's absolutely lots of shades of gray on this, and your perception may change over time as well. If we think about a meta-analysis, I believe, and we believe, this will be the most significant reinvention of work in our time. It may be smaller in some regions, it may be smaller for some businesses, it may be smaller for some roles, but if we look overall, globally, across the whole, this is going to be a huge reinvention of how we think about work. We can come back from the coronavirus and we can respond, but we have this amazing opportunity to use this as an accelerant. We have an amazing opportunity to push our offices, push our work experiences, push the things that attract and retain our employees to a new, greater place. And that's pretty cool. I'm a half full kind of person, but we really do have this opportunity to accelerate. I did an article not too long ago about cool new tech trends that are going to be kind of changing our work lives. And I talked to the head of research for the Consumer Electronics Board. They're the ones that do the show in Las Vegas every year that's kind of huge and legendary. And one of the things that he said that I thought was fascinating is that it's not that technology is so different than what it was before in terms of what was already in the pipeline. It's that this experience has changed our stretch and our acceptability standards. Like, we're willing to accept technology in ways that we haven't been before. And I think that's a really great example here as well. There may have been some things in the works in terms of work experience and how we think about that. And this accelerates and pushes us farther than we might have. So let's talk about what that looks like. One of the things that we know is that working from home is here to stay. George mentioned this at the beginning, where we know that work from home will continue. Every single customer we have talked to, which is hundreds over the last few months, is saying that work from home will be part of their future. Some of them say, you know, it's going to be a tiny percentage, not very much, but some. Others say, no, it will be a larger percentage. And we know that lots of companies have had work from home for a while. They accommodate remote work, they're global. Many of you all, many of us have been accommodating working from home. We also know work from home can be utterly exhausting. We're in the same environment all day, there's an intensity, we don't get out as much in terms of movement and shifting boundaries, and so it can be exhausting. It can also be pretty darn great. We get to see our child over our lunch hour, for example, or spend lots of quality time with our pets. And so some of those kinds of things can be fulfilling. We don't have our commute. However, it's probably a both and. It's probably less helpful to think to ourselves, is it going to be work from home or work in the office? It's going to be both as far as we can see and as far as we're hearing from a statistical point of view in terms of our customers. So this is about an expanded ecosystem. It's about more choices for people. One of the things that George talked about at the beginning is kind of this question of when people come back. And that will be so specific to your business and to your needs. It will also be specific to individuals, people's needs and their unique situation. And so the when of coming back has everything to do with how well the home is accommodating the work and how well the office accommodates us and the extent to which we can create places that are both safe and compelling. And we'll talk some more about that. Takeaway message here is that it will be a both and rather than an either or in terms of working from home or working from the office. So here are some perspectives about the why of the office that George introduced us to. That's where we want to spend a fair amount of our time because there are some really interesting dynamics and some interesting statistics in terms of why the office is here to stay and what's so darn magical about it anyway. One of the first things that we know about the office and why it's so critical is that it is all about innovation. We know that innovation comes from the edges. Sometimes you can get a great idea when you're a deep pro in an area, but a lot of times it's that person on the edge who asks the crazy question, or the person who is more naive about the problem and doesn't know the barriers who can bring up that new idea. The other thing about innovation is that innovation comes best from disparate ideas. It's running into the person in the work cafe who says something interesting. And then you run into somebody in the elevator lobby and they bring up something else. And then you're in your project team meeting and something else emerges and you put those things together for a creative idea or a new take on something. We can do lots of things virtually, absolutely, but we can innovate better when we're in person. The other thing that's interesting to think about in terms of innovation is the idea of speed. Innovation happens brilliantly when we are faster, when we're in a room together, appropriately socially distancing, and we're able to jump on each other's ideas. We're maybe able to constructively interrupt. We can demonstrate our full body language. We can be together with our Post-it notes on the board, wearing our safe masks. But there's something about being together. Nobody's on mute by accident. Nobody dropped the call. Nobody can't get on. Nobody's looking for a password in the background. And so we're able to just really come together. So innovation is one of the critical things that the office does for us, that being in person does for us together. Really interesting. In around 2008 or 2009, there was a downturn in the economy that was very significant. And lots of very high profile companies sent everybody home for cost saving reasons. And ultimately, they brought everybody back. And they were very high profile about bringing people back as well. They said, we need people in the office because we can't innovate as well. We can't differentiate as well. We're not serving our customers as well. And we're not having people as engaged as we'd like them to be. And so innovation ends up being a really important part of why the office can't go away and why it gives us so much magic. Again, we can do great innovation virtually. Thank goodness for video conferences and Zoom calls, but we can do it better in person. So here's a question for you about innovation. Just pop your answer in the chat as we did before. To what extent do you expect shifts in the way your company adds value to the market? A, massively, the pandemic has brought about a reboot and a reimagining of our business. B, moderately, some of what we do will change, but overall, we're still delivering value that's relevant to the times. C, minimally, we're continuing to deliver on our fundamental value equations without a lot of change. Or D, I have no idea, but I'll keep thinking about it. This is a great one, right? I think this is the MacGyver effect. For any of you who remember classic MacGyver, again, we're dating ourselves. Luckily, there's a newfangled MacGyver. MacGyver was a TV show and a guy who was always getting into scrapes. He was kind of like a high adventure guy. And it was really interesting because once he got into a scrape or a situation of being trapped in a bad experience, if he had a paperclip and a stick of chewing gum and I don't know, maybe a watch for some watch parts, he could build a rocket ship. It was all about improvisation. It was all about innovation. And the greatest barriers can absolutely be the things that make us most innovative. If there aren't a lot of barriers, you can kind of keep doing things in the same way you always have. But when things get really tough and you have to think about it differently, that's when innovation can occur brilliantly. So Jeff, how are we doing on this one? Are you seeing mostly A's, B's, mostly C's or D's?
A strong representation of the B's on this one, Tracy, so moderately.
Okay, brilliant. Sounds good. Yeah, I think this is our moment to really think about reinvention. This is our moment where a lot of the swim lanes that we might have been used to before are kind of blown apart. One of the predictions around the future of work is career opportunity, which seems really strange when our unemployment levels are higher than they have been since the Great Depression. But what happens is that swim lanes and kind of the traditional ways of doing things get a bit blown apart, and you can kind of reinvent and reimagine and reach for some new things as a company and as individuals. So it's all about innovation. Another key thing about why the office matters, why we come back, is all about talent and engagement. We know statistically, the more people work from home, the more likely they are to have a side hustle. The more likely they are to have a side hustle, the more likely they are to leave and pursue that full time. The more people work from home, the more likely they are to be multitasking. They're, folding laundry while they're on the project call, or they're doing their emails in the middle of the meeting. Those kinds of things are much more likely to occur when people are home. The other thing that's interesting is when people are in home offices, there are significantly more security concerns. 84% of IT leaders report that there are more people falling victim to phishing, more people that let things through the firewall, more things that get through the firewall. So security is a big deal. The other thing that I think is really important here is all about social capital. Social capital are those connections that we have for learning and growth and safe harbor support and new ideas. Social capital is good for people because it feels good to be connected to others. Social capital is also critical for businesses because it helps us get things done. We know who to go to get something done. We know who to go to if we're having trouble getting something through the process. We know who to go to solve a problem. We know who to go to get action. And those are the things that keep companies moving. There are lots of people who believe right now that our social capital is being diminished because we're not together in the office in order to build it. This is the idea that when you run into somebody in the parking lot as you're walking in together, you're getting to know people, you're investing in the relationship, you're building social capital in all kinds of ways. And people who have been more senior in their career or longer in their companies probably have more social capital in their bank balance, and they're withdrawing from it through these times. And what we need to do is give people plenty of opportunity to rebuild their social capital. So social capital is a really big deal and a really important reason that we're able to build in the office. You know, there are a lot of people you're staying close to virtually. They're the people you work with closely on a project, or the people that you already had pretty close relationships with already. It's those people who are further out in your network that you may not be seeing as much. It's the person that you run into in the work cafe or in the lunch line who you could, have a long conversation with and really, really connect, but you wouldn't necessarily set up time with them to do that in a formal way. Social capital is a really big deal in terms of us sticking together and us feeling rewarded in our work. And it's closely related as well to attraction and retention. Edgar Schein is a classic sociologist who talks about organizational culture. And you can think about organizational culture as an iceberg. Below the water level are norms and assumptions and values. You can't see them, even though they're palpable. Above the water level is place. Place is the most visible artifact of culture. When we're in an office, we get messages and cues about to what extent we value collaboration, to what extent we value well-being, to what extent we value privacy or respite, to what extent do we enable people with the best tools and technology. And without the place, it's sort of like cutting off one of our five senses. All of a sudden, I've got to, kind of walk around with my eyes closed or something, because the place isn't able to really fulfill that. The other thing that we know statistically and based on research is that people choose companies for the culture of the organization. That's the number one reason they join. The number one reason they stay is because of their team, because they have a best friend at work. And the number one reason they leave is because of leaders. All of that has everything to do with attraction and retention. We go to the office to feel connected. We go to the office to know about the culture within the office. We go to the office because the place is giving us cues all the time. The interesting thing about this is that when everybody went home, they didn't have as much access to others. You can't kind of look to your leader who's walking through your space to get a cue, or you can't check in with people who are right there with you. I have a colleague who loves to say, and I think this is brilliant, when everybody went home, we could no longer hear the birds singing. Isn't that nice as an analogy? You think about the disaster movie that you watch, right? Like there's a tsunami coming and it's going to hit the island, and all of a sudden everything's silent. The birds go silent and the wildlife has escaped to higher ground because they somehow know they need to. This is what's happening now, right? You can't hear people talking. You can't tune into what's going on in the organization. You can't overhear or check in or do the before or after in the meeting in the same way that you can in person. So this idea of being able to hear the birds chirping is a really big part of what we get in the organization and in the office. And before the call, Kyle had this brilliant statement. We were talking about the Derby and the lack of crowds, and he said, the roar of the crowd is missing. That is similar too, in terms of our inability to hear each other, our inability to kind of check in those nuanced ways when we're virtual rather than physical. So that's another reason that the office is critical. So here's another question for you. To what extent do you believe the work experience is part of attracting or retaining people? A, significantly, people pay attention to the work experience for sure. B, somewhat, it's important, but people may not realize it fully. C, not so much, I think it's really about other things. Or D, I'll have to tell you more offline. This one's kind of like I don't know, true information and true confessions based on your business. I think sometimes it can be the cobbler's children, right? Like sometimes we know stuff is important. We know work experience is important. And if you're not perfect at it, that's totally cool. I think it's just interesting to think about to what extent do you generally believe the work experience is important to attraction and retention. How are we doing on this one, Jeff? What are you mostly seeing here? A's or B's or C's or D's?
Well, no C's and D's. Significantly A's. Jean Mishlak used a lifetime of A's in her answer. So yes, overwhelming on A's.
Nice. Yes, I think so too. And I think the work experience is so holistic, right? Like it's about tools and space. It's also about process and culture. It's about the organization. It's about teams. It's about leaders. It's about all of those things coming together in a gestalt that we create for people. So I love it. I love it. Thank you for that. Another reason that the office is so important, the why of bringing people back that George set up for us, is all about purpose and energy. Harvard has proven through data and through studies that when companies have a common sense of purpose and a clear sense of purpose, they are significantly more likely to be successful in all kinds of business metrics. And we know that energy is also related here. When people come together, there's a sociological concept called the bandwagon effect. We tend to take energy from other people. We tend to read the crowd. We tend to feel the emotion of the crowd. There is something about showing up together that is very powerful. You may not even know that person that you see across the hall, but you're there together for a common purpose. This is the reason that we want to go to the club at 5 o'clock in the morning with our baseball hats on when we've got a treadmill on our lower level. There's something about showing up together in a place for a common purpose. And the other thing that's interesting here, SHRM did a study, the Society for Human Resource Management, and they found that 65% of companies were struggling with morale. This is a really big deal because when people aren't together, kind of feeling that upsurge, feeling that power of being together and of common purpose, we may suffer in terms of morale. This, again, is Kyle's comment about the roar of the crowd. This is the roar of the crowd that energizes you about the event that you're at, and the event you're at together is the success of your business. Movement and variety is also relevant here in terms of its connection to energy and purpose. There are some brilliant studies that demonstrate when we move, we're more physically healthy, great. Also, when we move, we tend to learn more. It literally cements learning. So if you're in a meeting and you're talking about something and then you move to the next meeting, you are more likely to remember the salient points of that meeting. When you have more variety, you're also in a better place in terms of your neuroscience. You literally will be more stimulated, you'll remember more, and you'll have better and newer ideas when there is variety into the process. And the place brings that variety, and the people in the place also add to that variety. Humanity and empathy is another huge one. I think this is one of the major things that people are missing right now. Connection is critical to our health. We are herd animals. We are tribe animals. We know there's safety in numbers. In fact, when we were in Roatan, my husband and our son and I, by the way, if we ever get to go on vacation again, I highly recommend Roatan. It's an amazing destination. They were doing this nighttime snorkel, great. And their guide said, well, we may run into some sharks. And if we run into sharks, he handed each of them a tin can with some coins in it. You're supposed to wiggle your tin can with your coins, to which I say, oh gosh, that doesn't sound like a very robust solution. I hope nobody gets into trouble with a shark. But the other thing he said was that if we see a shark, we all want to swim close together because the shark will interpret us as another larger creature rather than lots of small prey. That is something that we know as humans too. Our instinct is to come together, that there is strength in numbers. And when we can't do that, we get a sense of cognitive dissonance. It's hard on us. And we feel a sense of social isolation. According to one study, 75% of us are feeling social isolation and struggling to adjust. The other thing I have to say is a little woo-woo. This is about limbic resonance. We, when we're together with other people face-to-face and in person, tend to get in sync with them in terms of our mental processes and literally our brain waves. And the other thing is that when we are face to face and in person with people, we release a brain chemical called oxytocin. That is a feel-good chemical. It reduces stress, it helps us to feel happy, it helps us to feel content. It also dampens down adrenocorticotropin. Adrenocorticotropin releases things like adrenaline and cortisol, which are super important if we're running away from a saber-toothed tiger, but not so good over the long term in terms of our mental and our physical health. And so when we are with people, we literally reduce our brain stress and we literally increase the health from a brain standpoint because we're releasing oxytocin and dampening down adrenocorticotropin. So it feels great to be with our friends, and there are lots of really great reasons from science that suggest that that's super justified. I'm going to keep going here and talk a little bit about variety and movement. I talked about this a minute ago, but let me go into just a little bit of detail here. The other thing that's important is that we are suffering from time compression and time disorientation and temporal disintegration. When we lose routines and when everything kind of feels like it's running in together, we can have this feeling that we're out of time, like, oh my gosh, how is it already September? I think I might have missed Memorial Day and the 4th of July and Labor Day in there. You lose track of what day it is because everything's happening in the same moments, in the same environments. We're not leaving the house to go to work on a regular schedule. We may not be going out to dinner as much on a weekend. And those routines and rhythms are really important to our sense of orientation. They're also important to our sense of stimulation. So that's another reason that the office is super important. Going into work together is part of a routine. It's part of a really healthy pattern. And speaking of really healthy patterns, it has everything also to do with boundary. I've spent lots of years studying work life. And one of the interesting things is that we've always had this discussion in the work life world, and sociological literature is rife with discussion about how we leave work at work. How do we have a boundary? How do we make sure that work stays behind so we can focus on the personal? And that has shifted 180 degrees. And now, interestingly, people are saying, how do I get a little more distance from personal? I'd like to get a little more distance from, I don't know, the dishes in the sink or the tiff I had with my partner this morning, or, oh, all of the new learning about algebra that I'm doing to help my child. Those are good things to be with my child and to help my child and to support learning, but wow, algebra was a while ago. Those are things that sometimes people want to move away from. And there is a really healthy thing about some distance between work and life. Work is part of a full life, and we all have different right answers in terms of how much we integrate and bring those together. And that is all good. And it's really great to have some distance now and then. A break from a good thing is still a good thing, and we can reduce distractions. And finally, culture. I talked a little bit about this before, but culture is true north for an organization. And interestingly, I like to say that culture is the way things get done around here. Culture is, quote unquote, what people do when no one's looking. When we sent everybody home, culture started to do even harder work because culture became the rudder for how we're making decisions, for the kinds of decisions we're making, for the ways we're communicating, for the ways that we're maintaining our relationships. And distance is detrimental. We need that regular cadence with each other to really reinforce culture. And a lot of times, physical distance can turn into psychological distance and a lack of psychological safety. We want people to have psychological safety so they can bring their best, so they can take appropriate risks, so they can bring their best talents and their most creative ideas. And culture creates the context for that to happen really effectively. Without place, it's hard for those to occur. So in terms of how we bring people back and when we bring them back, we think choice is one of the things that's important to think about. And there are 5 ways to think about choice. One is we probably need to give people more choice than ever about when they come back, how they come back, and how much they come back. Because my sense of worry or security may be really different than yours in terms of my own health or people that I care about or care for. The office itself needs to offer plenty of choice. I may feel most comfortable in an open part of the campus, you in an enclosed room. I may feel most comfortable at a workstation I go to every time and I know I've cleaned it. You may feel more comfortable finding a less dense spot any day of the week for a place that you're going to settle down and work. The other thing is that different groups need to be accommodated differently in terms of the space, and so we need to have flexibility there. We need to have flexibility in the short term in terms of the space, like furniture that we can move around, settings that can adjust, because what we know today in September may be really different than October or November. And finally, we have the opportunity to learn about business continuity. God forbid there's another pandemic 2 years from now or some other thing that interrupts business continuity. But we will have learned about the process to maintain business continuity one way or the other. So these are important ways to think about choice and flexibility. I think it's all about action. We don't want to get pandemic paralysis. By putting our toes back in the water and starting to have people come back to work, we get to learn, we get to grow, and we will figure it out together. And we can bring back all of those things like innovation and humanity and empathy and really support for mental health and for mental functioning. So it's a really good idea for us to take action. So with that, I'm going to hand it to you, Jeff, and see what kinds of questions we have before we kind of think about closing out. Any questions that are starting to come in, Jeff, in terms of a little bit of a Q&A opportunity?
Not quite yet. I'm sure there will be some once we get rolling. So for everybody, this is a great time to ask Tracy any question you might want to. Her experience, I've known her for a good long time. Her experience is rich and deep, and she's had numerous conversations and engagements with businesses across North America and actually the world. So a great resource for virtually any question you want to ask at this stage. I do, have a couple of my own as I was listening to the presentation, Tracy, that I'll just kick us off. I think you made some amazing points about innovation that we take for granted, the fact that it comes from the edges. It's best when it comes from disparate ideas. And so this is an innovation question. Like, what are some of the ways that organizations and leaders can work to sustain innovation when we're working in a non-workplace, many of us from home environment?
Yeah, wow, that's such a good question. I think that one of the ways is to be really clear about the direction and kind of common goals. Like when we're excited about that purpose, we'll be more innovative. So I think that's one, is to, as a leader, really be clear about direction and clear about kind of where we're going. I think another one is to really keep people connected together, and to keep people connected who don't always work together as a matter of course. But if you've got a team and you've got kind of a purview of that team, you can connect people who wouldn't normally work together and be really intentional about that. I think that's the other thing that we've learned through this, is that some connections will just continue in an organic way, but a lot of times we need that intentionality and that planning in terms of our connections. So that's another one, is to keep people connected, keep different kinds of people connected in terms of innovation. And I think the third thing is to make sure that people feel safe to innovate. That, a lot of times innovation requires some risk taking, right? It's that kooky idea that somebody was brave enough to throw out in a meeting that kind of turned into something that ended up being pretty cool. In order to throw out that kooky idea, you need to feel like you're pretty safe, like you've got that level of psychological safety and those close connections with others. And if those have eroded over the pandemic because we're not together as much, as a leader, I think it's a really good idea to try to make sure that those relationships stay really solid, that people feel free to contribute, that you reward and reinforce and recognize when people are putting something out there that may be new or different. There's a great mantra that says there are two ways to kill an idea. One is to say, oh, we've never done that before, or to say, oh, we've already tried that. So there are so many ways to kill an idea. And I think as leaders, as team members, as influencers, no matter what our position, we can just be really open to ideas and really reinforce when people try something new or throw out something new.
Thanks for that. You've quelled my curiosity and probably others on that one as well. I might pronounce your name wrong, sir, so forgive me. It's Michael Rescio has a question, Tracy.
Great.
I'll read it verbatim. How do you determine how much company or customer communication is enough versus too little or too much? Kind of the communication paradox.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Part two is, how do you monitor this to change over time?
Ah, boy, that's such a good question. You know, I think I actually have an article about this and we'll send it to you afterwards. I've got a couple. There's one about communication how-tos. There's another one about bad news and being super transparent about bad news and how that is a good thing. So I think in general right now, more communication is better. I think that in normal times, we can overload people with communication, but in general, more is better. One of the things that's happening right now from a dynamics standpoint is that people are increasingly looking to their leaders and their companies as the single source of truth. There's so much coming at us, and first of all, we've got to sort through it. Secondly, we've got to figure out like what's real and what's not, and what should I pay attention to. And so companies are becoming a single source of truth. By that, I mean, people are looking to their companies and their leaders to make sense of things, to say, here's what's happening, here's what it means for our company, here's what it means for our department, here's what it means for your role. And so I think that lots of communication that helps people make sense is also really helpful. I think the other thing is that we a lot of times err on the side of like not telling people until we know more. Like, well, we better not tell them yet because we don't know yet. We better not tell them yet because of X, Y, Z. And I think in times when there's incredible uncertainty, people appreciate just hearing you, even if you talk about the fact that you don't know yet. We were working with a CEO and he said, I don't want to do a weekly call. I don't have anything new to say. And we reassured him that even if he talked about what he was working on, what he was focusing on, what he was wondering about, it would really help quell people's concerns because they needed that regular voice, that regular cadence. So regular cadence is another. And I think the other thing, if we think about like how much is too much, think about the concept of pull and push. Push communication, you get it whether you wanted it or not. Pull, there's always more you can pull down from the intranet. There's always more you can go and get if you're an employee who's creating more and more. And I think that the other thing that's become really popular right now are pulse surveys. Lots of companies are, even on a weekly basis, kind of pulsing in to figure out how are people doing. And that's a really good way to figure out how much is too much. And I think that leaders cannot check in too much. There was a brilliant study a few months ago. I wrote an article about mental health, and that study is referenced there. And one of the things it said is that when people felt like their leader was empathetic, when leaders checked in with people, it was really perceived positively and it was contributing to mental health. So I think that's the other thing, is for us to be intentional as leaders about, are you getting enough? Do you need more? We're being as transparent as we can in terms of our practices and our policies and our approaches, but also we have leaders who are kind of tapping in and being able to give us a pulse on things if we're not doing a regular pulse survey. So those are some ideas.
Net out, more is more, right?
There you go.
Couple more questions here. First one from Austin Bates. There have been a number of studies on a need for a diverse office space prior to the pandemic, referencing in parens Google and tech companies in general. Would you say there is more of a need for this kind of space diversity now more than before? And or is the timing now just more opportune in this state of transition? So really about how we see the diverse space footprints and commenting on those.
Yeah, I think this is, I do think it's all about continued variety in the space. We're hearing a really interesting trend at a macro level that lots of companies are going to an expanded ecosystem, which includes home and hub and spoke. And so employees are having higher expectations for how we support them in their home offices. Hub locations may not be able to do every single thing they could do before. Like in the past, they might have been able to support us in terms of focus, collaborate, learn, rejuvenate, socialize. if we make an assumption that there'll be some residue over time of reduced density, we may not be able to do all the same things in the same square footage. And so what we're hearing is that we may want to emphasize in hubs things like generative work, co-creative work, collaborative work, community work. That may be the way that we want to prioritize space and prioritize the settings that we bring into the space. And then spoke locations might be those places where people are really wanting to focus. They can't focus at home because of the dog or the kids or whatever, and they need to go to a place, and that's the place where they can kind of focus in. So I think lots of variety will still be super smart, again, because like I may have a different perception of safety and security and different needs in terms of what the space delivers so that I can feel safe and secure. So more variety will be better. And we may think about prioritization of the variety. I may spend more of my variety footprint on co-creative or collaborative or generative space, and maybe less overall of my footprint on focus space in a hub, maybe vice versa, if I happen to have a spoke in a low cost market, for example. So I think that variety will always be critical, and more choice is probably better. We've got a brilliant study that looked at the correlation between choice and engagement. The more choice we give people and control over their work experience, the more they are engaged. And that continues to be true even now that we're in the middle of the pandemic and post-pandemic.
This next question is kind of an overlay to that one, actually. So shifting from a sort of why use of space to a personality type use of space, the question is, can you talk a little about introverts versus extroverts in an office environment where some might thrive and others might do better with less social pressure?
Yeah. Oh, this is so interesting, right? I wrote an article about loneliness, like it seems like lots of articles and research is about people missing their people. And then there are other people who are like, no, I'm pretty good at home, actually. I'm kind of good. And then there are people who are saying, I am terribly lonely. I just can't get out as much. I think the key thing for us to think about is that all of us need time alone. All of us need time together. Those proportions are different based on our personality styles. And for some, actually the pandemic has added pressure because, their team's doing a Zoom happy hour and they have no excuse. They can't say, ooh, I'm going to be out at my yoga class because yoga was canceled, or, ooh, I'm going to be traveling because they're not traveling. And so it's interesting, this kind of push, pull, give, take that's occurred in terms of personality styles. I think the key that's super interesting is that more variety in the space and more choice for people. I know I just talked about that. I sound like a girl with a hammer looking for nails, but that is also relevant to the personality conversation. Because if I'm an introvert, I may actually like to be out and about. And a lot of times we hear from introverts that they feel pretty darn good in like a work cafe. You can be alone together. You can actually have a pretty private call when there's lots of white noise around and nobody really paying attention. On the other hand, that introvert may prefer an enclave or some really private space, especially now if that's the one place you can take off your mask, for example. On the other hand, those extroverts may love to be around people, but they can't be around people as much if they really want to focus in and really want to get some things done in a time-sensitive way. And so I think that introvert-extrovert conversation is super helpful, and that work content conversation is super helpful to have people really think consciously about where do they do their best work and what are the environments or settings that can support that, because that can be so individual for individual people. And if there's enough variety, no matter your personality type, you can really think about syncing your choices and your variety of your setting with the kind of work that you need to get done and how you do it best. So I love the question, and there's so much nuance to it.
No further questions from the audience. We have a couple minutes. I had another one written down, which maybe you might want to address. I hope others find this as interesting as I do. You talked a bit about culture and culture's relationship to space in a formative, reinforcing sense. So if we also know that culture needs to transcend space, it can't just be about space, it's bigger than that. So if culture needs to transcend physical engagement, what are the elements of that drive the most success?
Yeah, culture is, I'm aging myself one more time. Remember the old graphic equalizers? Remember there was like this, for those of you who don't remember, there was this technology thing and it had all these teeny little buttons and you could adjust your listening experience with a million different variables. Culture is a little bit like that. The most constructive, productive cultures are those that balance flexibility and stability. Brilliant cultures are stable over time and they are flexible and able to move with the market. It is a tension that is appropriately between those two. Brilliant cultures are also putting into balance external focus and internal focus. So we're really able to focus internally and get down to what we need, and we're able to focus externally. And so as we think about the variables of culture, it has everything to do with mission and direction and really clear leadership. And it has to do with involvement and participation, people's capabilities being developed, and the opportunity for people to really feel empowered. It has to do with consistency in terms of policies and practices that help us to continue over time in the way that we've been successful. And it has to do with adaptability, really being able to adapt and shift to competitors and markets and competition, and our customers' demands as well, and shifts in the marketplace. So those are the things that really create a constructive, productive culture. And I would say too, culture is never static. And so it's always something that we're working toward, that we're working to get better on. I wrote an article about this, about what we knew about culture and what's new about culture. We can send you a link to that one. So Jeff, maybe I'll hand it back to you. And I know George and Kyle were going to also weigh in terms of how we can help. We've talked about bringing people back, about when and where and how and why. And now we want to get much more into the how.
Thank you, Tracy. To you, George.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Tracy. And just a couple closing comments. First of all, thanks for those that attended. We know your time is valuable, and we really appreciate the hour that you've invested with us. I don't know, hopefully you walk away with new insights, you walk away with some inspiration, and you walk away feeling like you're prepared and ready to take action. I know I walked away. You know, it's interesting, you come in and we talk about space, and at the end, he's talked more about people, relationships, and providing really space in order to allow them to do their best work. And I think we have an opportunity, and we'll talk a little bit about how we might help you with that, to not retreat and fall prey to the virus and to the situation, but use it as an opportunity to pivot and allow us as organizations and allow us individually to do our best work. So with that in mind, we've got two offers that are unique to those that are GLI members. The first is, we're prepared to offer a 20% discount off the market price for work at home products. So think of it as a height adjustable desk, monitor arms, a good proper ergonomic chair, any other items you'd want. The second is a COVID-19 workplace floor plan audit. You're probably going, what the heck is that? So really what we would do is we would summarize and apply the concepts and ideas that Tracy went through today in terms of the 5 principles of flexibility and lay those up against safety. So how do you balance the tension between the two to make sure your environment is both safe to come home, but at the same time, it's supporting your brand, it's supporting your culture, it's supporting innovation, it's building social capital and those other things that are really important to you as an entity. In order to take advantage of that, we've given you 2 ways. You can call Summer at 502-589-8400, or we've got her email address here, sthompson@oriusa.com. And if you mention this seminar, you'll receive the other benefits. So again, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. And I'll turn it back to Carla.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to ORI and Steelcase for being with us today. And thanks to all of you all for being with us today. We are all in this together. And as the voice of your business community, GLI continues to support you during this critical time with the latest news on legislative issues and their impact on your business, and resources that are available to help you and your employees get through this crisis. We are working hard to plan for how our community will prepare for a time after COVID-19. For a summary of today's discussion or access to other resources, please check back and visit greaterlouisville.com. We have included the link to our event survey in the chat feature, and a reminder email will be sent later today, and we invite your feedback. A recording of today's meeting will also be available on our website. We hope you join us at our next webinar, which is Friday, September 11th from 11:30 to 12:30. featuring an expert panel of HR professionals and attorneys discussing the recent developments of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the implications on federal FMLA. Please stay safe and well and have a good day, everyone.